Greetings, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. This is part of my series about GCSE history, looking at international relations between 1918 and 39. So in this video, I will examine the impact of the Great Depression on France and the United Kingdom with regard to their foreign policy. So the Great Depression had a severe set of consequences for France and the UK, caused mass unemployment. These countries depended heavily on exports, and there was less of a tax take. The governments had to pare back spending. Anti-democratic parties grew popular in France. The communists and various ultra-nationalist factions like Croix de Feu, Cross of Fire. So appeasement became the conventional wisdom. Fighting a war wouldn't benefit anyone. It was very unattractive. Communists said, war is a capitalist thing, it's a racket, it's just to make these arms manufacturers wealthier. So the French proletariat should not fight the German proletariat, that's the working class. Collective security went out of fashion. It became, in a sense, isolationism. They would trade with other countries, although tariff barriers were erected, but their military alliances, they wouldn't honour them. Oddly, France entered a few more military alliances, as we'll see, didn't honour most of them. So people were desperate to believe that war could be avoided because the horror of the First World War was such a fresh memory. Hardly a family was untouched by that. As Lloyd George said, every dining table had its empty chair. That was the chair of one of the relatives who got killed in the war. Anyone who advocated standing up against the Third Reich was denounced as a warmonger. So it's difficult to remember that Churchill was deeply unpopular in the 30s. When he said, nope, we got to have a backbone and not give ground to the Third Reich, he was howled down. So people acidly said that he was a fool and he'd caused the catastrophe at Gallipoli in the First World War, and he was just cantankerous, living in the past. He was against Indian self-government, so people dismissed him as just a ranter. He was a loon, they thought. There was the Hoare-Laval Pact, which you might remember, when France and the UK tried to find a compromise about Italy conquering Abyssinia. A dishonourable compromise, many people said. It was the end of Samuel Hoare's career. Pierre Laval, who continued in government in France, was executed after the Second World War for collaborating with the Third Reich. The Munich Agreement of September 1938 is a prime example of appeasement. France and the UK consenting to the Sudetenland being taken by Germany. And this did not satiate the aggressor states. It only whetted their appetite for fresh meat. So appeasement did buy precious time for France and the UK, and it enabled them to rearm, and therefore they could give a decent account of themselves when it eventually came to a war against Germany. So the Great Depression is largely responsible for destroying the League of Nations. It brought people to power who had open disdain for the League of Nations, people who were hyper-aggressive, who really were militarists. France and the UK stopped paying much attention to the League of Nations. Germany, Italy, Japan, the Soviet Union, they all withdrew from the League of Nations. Countries were not willing to pay their membership dues to the League of Nations. The League of Nations became increasingly irrelevant, and the organization was formally dissolved in 1946. By that stage, its successor organization, the United Nations, had been functioning for a year. It was founded in San Francisco, even before the end of the Second World War. And in fact, the Allies in the Second World War sometimes called themselves the United Nations. Then the UN had its first General Assembly in London, Methodist Central Hall, but its headquarters then became New York. So that was that. Well, going off the curriculum a bit, I have to reflect that Germany did incredibly well in the Second World War to fight for so long. I'm not making a moral judgment. I know there were countless atrocities committed by the Third Reich, absolutely no doubt about that. But leaving morality aside, just in a country with not a huge population, managing to fight for so long despite being hugely outnumbered. The thing is, if only Germany had a middle-of-the-road government come to office in the 30s and reduce unemployment, get the economy back on track, Germany had such incredible economic potential, such a tremendous capacity for manufacturing, and they would have lifted the Germans out of their suffering and just been at peace and had a prosperous life, and everybody a lot happier, and nobody would have been killed. My other reflection is that Neville Chamberlain gets a very bad press. We know that 60 million people were killed in the Second World War. It's very difficult to absorb the sheer number of that. 60 million people. Would it have been worse if all that was avoided? If it is possible to avoid bloodshed, should we avoid it? And that's what Chamberlain did his damnedest to do. He desperately tried to avoid a war which he knew was going to kill millions upon millions of people. And that for that he should be applauded and not execrated. And he also bought time. So I think Chamberlain's very underrated. He did what he did, and he did the best he could in difficult circumstances where the public did not want to fight, where the United Kingdom was not well equipped to fight, where allies were unsteady and all the rest of it, and he took every possible chance for peace. And by September 1939, the United Kingdom was militarily as well as psychologically prepared to fight. There are, of course, appeasers who said the UK just should have stood aloof. Other countries did nothing, didn't support the German annexation of Poland, maybe spoke out against it, but took no military action, and that was that. And it was going to be absolutely horrendous for the Poles under German occupation. Yes, that's true, but was it better that 60 million people died? I don't actually know what the death toll would have been if it hadn't. And in 1939, people didn't know the death toll of the Second World War was going to be, but it was going to be very high indeed. Germany was a major industrialized country, more or less a superpower at that stage, and would not be easily defeated. And there are many, many good Germans. Nobody's born bad for being a certain nationality. People on the Allied side, they weren't all good. They just were on that side because they happened to belong to a particular nationality. People who were on the Axis side, they weren't all wicked. They just happened to belong to a particular nationality. People follow the crowd. That is the safe thing to do. People are sheepish. They get propaganda from their government. It's not all false. They mostly believe it. They choose to believe it. And so very few people have the moral courage to go against their government. I'm for my country. I'm against my government. Your government could pursue bad policies. The unpopular thing is sometimes the right thing to do. But very, very few people are valiant enough to do so. That's why traitor can be the most honourable word of all. Loyalty can be a vice when it is blind loyalty, when it's your attitude is my people right or wrong. I'm going to fight for my country even if my government is doing something that's grossly immoral. Say no, help the other lot, because we're all human and that's what matters. It's the individual doing right. And I have more in common with various individuals, not someone who happens to be born on the same island as me or whatever, the same colour or ethnicity or something like that, or culture, doesn't necessarily give me that much in common with that person. And that's the major lesson I take for that. And got to salute to those ethnic Germans who were against Nazism. Very difficult to do. Got to ask yourself some uncomfortable questions. What if you had grown up in the Third Reich? Would you have had that incredible bravery to turn against your own people? I don't think so. You would have been given short shrift. Very likely you would have ended up swinging from piano wire.